I'm really excited about this. Yes, we are going to start a little bit early, but heck, you guys read the program. We're going to cover a lot in a very short amount of time. A real quick anecdote. I'm a big fan of Social Engineer Toolkit and all the stuff that you guys do. Funny thing, when I'm back home, I do a lot of security awareness talks for other attorneys. And this spring, I did a live demo. It was crazy. And did a live demo of Social Engineer Toolkit. And who's in the audience but the Chief Justice of the Missouri Supreme Court.
Awesome.
So you've been terrifying a lot of powerful people for a long time, and I'm really excited to see the new stuff.
Awesome.
Let's give him a big hand.
Wow, it's Sunday and you all are still here, so a round of applause for you. I'm sure everybody's experiencing delayed reactions, headaches, so we have a lot of like shrieking and loud noises throughout our presentation, just to kind of keep it fresh and content here-wise. Just kidding. Just a quick intro. I'm Dave Kennedy. I started Trusted Sec in Binary Defense, which is my company's. And what's funny is I just saw somebody here that I used to work with in the military, and it's funny how you kind of see all of the people that you kind of grow through in this industry with, as well as a whole bunch of new people that are coming into the industry. And I got to get a hug yesterday. I'm a big hugger guy, but I got a hug yesterday from somebody that was just coming into the industry saying, hey, I'm so passionate about what I'm doing. I'm learning from all of this, and I'm learning from everybody else. And that's the biggest thing that when I was coming into DEF CON, I think DEF CON 8 or 9 was my first DEF CON. And the thing that I came into and I learned about was just learning from other people, because everybody's so damn smart in this industry, and no one knows everything else that the other person knows. So it's all about that in that community, and DEF CON's such a great place for that. And I have to give a round of applause to everybody that makes DEF CON possible, the goons that cleared up all the traffic flow after the first day, giving their nights and their nights over and over again. Let's give a round of applause for everybody at DEF CON. So I authored the Social Engineer Toolkit, a couple of other tools. I'm actually going to be showing one today called the Pen Testers Framework, which I added a new module in for Pivoter that Geoff wrote that we're going to be releasing today. But we'll get into that. Geoff? Oh, this is Geoff's first time presenting at DEF CON, so can we give him a round of applause for getting up here and having balls?
All right, well, as Dave already introduced me, I'm Geoff Walton. I'm a senior security consultant at Trusted Sec. One of the things I do like to do a little bit on the side when I get time is to actually write some tools and create some things. I've authored a tool called Ships that's pretty popular, and recently I wrote a tool called Pivoter. So that's kind of who I am. So Dave's going to talk a little more about kind of the history of pen testing and stuff like that, and what we do at Trusted Sec.
So real quick, when we come up with acronyms for tools, it's kind of funny. Ships was actually going to be Chips, because one of our guys ate 7 bags of chips one time in one sitting. So we're going to, in his honor, name Chips after this specific tool. But unfortunately, we couldn't come up with a good acronym for Chips, so it ended up changing it to Ships, which kind of sounds piratey. So it sounded pretty good, but Pivoter was one of those ones where, just sounded kind of cool. And I think, what was your original name for it? Proxy something or other?
So this is, that mic's not hot. So this is kind of funny. Actually, Dave seems to have a habit. I come up with very boring, rather descriptive names for my tools that pretty much say what they actually do. I originally called this thing Proxy Kit, and like every other thing I write, Dave immediately renamed it, which is awesome, because Dave's names are really better.
Sweet. All right, so we'll get into the talk here. Look a little bit about the history of how attackers kind of move and kind of our challenges as pen testers in the past. If you look at pen testing in general, right? Anybody here pen tester? Like a whole bunch of people. That's awesome. The first thing that we do as an attack is we go after an infrastructure. Right? We try to find an exposure, whether that's social engineering or going after a specific attack on a web application or whatever it ends up being. We end up finding a flaw. We compromise that, and then we get access to one system, right? And we get access to that one system. And that one system, if we have elevated rights, we have the ability to kind of move over into other systems, right? And then from there, we try to go after a couple other things and get a little bit more information here and a little more information here. It's like a puzzle, right? We kind of put together a little puzzle until we get access to the stuff that we want access to. And so if you look at that, the whole lateral movement thing is a big, talk right now. It's been difficult for us, I guess, in the industry, unless you're using something like pro versions. Like Metasploit Pro, for example, has a VPN functionality where if you compromise, you can tunnel and pivot through a interpreter session. Or like Cobalt Strike or those ones have the ability to tunnel if you have administrative level rights, right? So all of these different things are concepts that we use every single day, and then attackers use every single day to go after specific targets, and then from there move across the network. So to kind of talk a little bit about that, if you look at lateral movement, you compromise one system, right? And there's like random Chuck Norris things throughout this whole presentation. There's no relevance to them whatsoever. But if you look at lateral movement in an organization, it's about compromising a system, getting information, whether that's credentials or clear text credentials with Mimikatz or something, and then spraying across the network and going to other systems to get access to them. And so in that case, we look at that and say, well, it's difficult in a lot of cases to escalate our permission sometimes. Like, for example, let's just say you have a an organization that doesn't run at administrative level rights, or you compromise a network service account, something that you have the ability to target and you have access to a system, but maybe there's not enough information on that system to get you to another one to move laterally in the environment. So that's been experience of mine and Geoff's in almost every pen test that you run into, that you target an individual, an organization that has very limited permissions to actually go about that. And so, when we look at that, when you look at what we do as pen testers, it's really about thinking outside of the box, right? We have to come up with creative ways to navigate security restrictions or mechanisms that are in place to stop us from attacking different things. And in most cases, we do. We get crafty. I mean, maybe we find that our one exploitation method that we got into wasn't successful, right? And then we go to another avenue that may have been successful. And then from there, we may go to other systems that may get us, the types of information that we need. But it requires us to think outside the box. And unfortunately, today, the focus has really been around just getting domain admin rights, right? And I see someone taking a picture of that screen. I apologize. Don't Google clock and forget the L. But when you look at a lot of the types of attacks that we do, and the types of methods we do, it's mostly around getting domain administrative level rights, right? If we get DA, that's it, and that's kind of how we, target our tests. But that's not really what we're seeing out there as far as attackers. Attackers want access to information. They want access to things that make us unique in organizations. Like, for example, everybody's always worried about PII and credit card data. Well, that's great for like the retail space, right? But for manufacturing, that's less of a concern. I mean, customer information is always a concern. But manufacturing is focused more on, how do we make the product, the chemical compounds, who our suppliers are, and how much we pay for those types of products and the vendors between those. So those are the intellectual property pieces that make that company unique as an organization. And we don't really target that as part of what we simulate as an attack. So we're kind of at a disadvantage, and we're not really simulating how attackers go after an organization to really try to attack those different types of areas. So for me, looking at this, we have to evolve to a different type of framework, or a different type of way of attacking organizations. It's not to say that what we're doing is not right. It's just we need to think a little bit differently in our mindset of going in. It's not about smashing and getting root and then using root to get access to another system, and from there we own them, and then we high-five each other, and then we give them a report of how awesome we owned them, right? It's more so about how do we go after an organization and figure out what makes them tick, what makes them unique, and how do we target them to go after them in a way that is beneficial. And how can we do that with the types of techniques that the attackers are using and what we can use in our own arsenal. That's where we'll talk a little bit here in just a second about Pivoter and the release of Pivoter and what that actually does. So for me, if I'm a sophisticated attacker, right, I'm going to go after what makes a company unique. I'm going to go after what makes them unusual. And what's interesting today is that if you look at kind of the history of breaches, you saw, and I hate to mention the specific breaches because we've all been hurt, we've had it hyped in the media, but it's a specific point. When Target happened, you had executives that were fired, right? If you look at the past, maybe 5 breaches in the past year and a half, you notice they've all blamed them on sophisticated hackers. And it's like a crux of like, hey, we got targeted by sophisticated hackers, even though we've neglected security for the past 10 years and we haven't, funded security for the past 10 years, and we haven't given security any light of day, we still got targeted by a sophisticated attack, so now that's okay, right? And by the way, the sophisticated attacks are like 4 lines of bash. So does anybody here know how to write a couple lines in bash, a little for loop in bash? You are all APTs. Congratulations. Sophisticated attacks are bullshit. It's all about everybody being targeted. We're all getting targeted. It's a matter of if you got targeted or not and how often your security program is up to date and refreshed as an organization. And so if you look at that, we now have an excuse in security to say, well, if I'm ever targeted by an attacker that I might attribute to North Korea, I might attribute to China, I might attribute to Russia, it's just a sophisticated attack, so it's okay. It's not okay. And we need to be building defenses against those. And I'll talk a little bit about what a targeted attack looks like in some of the areas that we struggle with sometimes when we're doing our pen tests. So this one was a fun one. We get to go on red team engagements, and you have the traditional pen testing, like, hey, we want an internal, external pen test. Hey, this is for PCI, or hey, this is for whatever. But every once in a while you get a customer, it's like, hey, I want you to do like a full scope red team engagement, right? And there's different maturity levels of that. Like customers that really want a red team, a lot of times are like, well, I want you to do a red team engagement, but like literally you have to do it between like 3 and 4 p.m. on Tuesday, and you can't break in anything, and you can only talk to one person. And so, in cases like that, it's not really a red team, right? But in this case, this customer was actually pretty awesome, and wanted us to do a attack against them, simulating a red team, and any method was available. Like whatever you wanted to do, aside from like breaking windows and punching people in the face, right? You couldn't do that apparently. We asked, like, well, if we get busted, can we punch people in the face and run away? No. Okay, cool. Wouldn't really punch people in the face. I'm a hugger. I would have hugged them. But the whole purpose was this: they had spent a lot of time on R&D and protecting research and development and intellectual property for their future products. And why that's important, manufacturing companies, the sustainability of them really depends on their products and how they can refresh their products and get to market with those products. If someone gets a hold of them well ahead of them releasing, it's very disastrous, especially if it's other countries competing against them or other different types of competitors. So the R&D piece, where they do the research on the next I'll use the word next generation type of product line, right? A lot of times that's the most important piece of the sustainability long term of an organization, whether or not they can still compete. I came from a company that really had a tough time diversifying themselves in the market that they were in, and had a tough time in their next product lines, and they're still suffering because they couldn't keep up with what they were trying to do. And so in this case, the customer wanted us to target it and actually go after them in a way that actually compromised them in any way I wanted to. So the first thing, I'm like, well, I'll go after phishing, right? Because that's the easiest. Phishing's always great. And so with phishing, obviously creating a scenario or something that's believable is one of the most important pieces. So creating a fantasy. What I started to do first is like looking at what I could do to compromise them. So I started looking at their outside, and I found a file upload vulnerability that allowed me to pop a web shell. And if anybody been in a web shell before under IIS, like an iUser account, very limited, right? You don't have a squat to do anything with network service. Like you can't escalate permissions, you can't grab Kerberos tokens in a lot of cases. You're really restricted to usually like the inet pub directory or whatever the directory is running in. Sometimes you can find like a web.config file. Sometimes you can find sensitive data that you can use to maybe tunnel and piggyback to a SQL server or something like that. But in a lot of cases, you're pigeonholed in that environment that you can't move in different directions. So I was kind of at a dead end at this point. We hadn't made Pivoter yet, so that would have been really nice, by the way, Geoff. Thank you. So anyways, I had to do a little hard work here. And what we ended up doing is using that website and creating a sub website of that website to be like a survey type thing. And we had a username and password field and stuff like that in there. And then we started thinking like, well, if I go and I can create a website that's on the customer's domain and I can send emails to a customer with that domain in there, it's probably pretty legit. And so what we ended up doing is we sent it out to a couple of folks, and we ended up compromising someone in the sales organization, which salespeople are like phenomenal. They're great. Like you can have salespeople do anything you want to. Like especially if you're going to give them money, that's the best. Like they'll be like, hey, can you like disable your antivirus so you can open up this Excel macro document that says virus.xls? Sure, no problem. Okay, cool. Am I still going to get the sale? Yeah, cool. Okay. But anyways, we used that and we compromised them, and we got access to the OWA account. I don't understand companies still. Like I would say predominantly like 90% of the customers that we run into, VPN is 2-factor, and their OWA is not. So like you have access to full OWA access, but you don't have access to VPN, which like OWA is like for a hacker is like the best piece that could ever happen, because you already have established lines of communication and trust. So if you have trust already and you already have communications where someone's already talking and sending emails back and forth, it's really easy to send them something. You're like, bloop, click that, and you click it, and they're compromised, right? So a lot of times it's very easy to attack somebody through OWA as a mechanism for those. And what's funny about like 2-factor, for example, you may have heard of phone factor. Right? It's a 2-factor authentication solution. There's also a couple other ones too. But has anybody got the ones where like it'll actually call you and ask you if you're logging in, or it'll give you a push notification if you want to allow it to log you in or not? Do you know how bad that is from a security perspective? You know how many times I've been on a pen test? The past like 7 to 10 pen tests that have that type of functionality in it, where it actually calls you or will say, are you logging in right now? Allow or deny. How many times they just hit allow because they think they're logging in somewhere? Like literally, I went into a pen test one time, broke in, logged in with my username and password, and it's like, please wait while we call you. And I'm like, oh crap. And I'm like, uh-oh, I'm busted. And there goes my whole fish. There's 2 days worth of work and all this other stuff. And all of a sudden you log in, and you're sitting there and you're waiting at the screen, so you're like, okay, I'm screwed. I'm just have to start building a new pretext. And all of a sudden you log in, you're like, that was weird. So whenever you give the users the ability to error, what will they do? They will error, right? Unless you teach them right. But in most cases, like 2-factor authentication, if it's not implemented properly, is also a problem. So just saying from a caveat. But anyways, they didn't have 2-factor in OWA, so it didn't make a difference. So what was interesting is if you're familiar with the tool that I wrote called Unicorn, it does PowerShell injection, and it does native x86 shellcode injection through PowerShell, and then it injects into memory, and then it gives you a interpreter shell through there, right? And so the last version of Unicorn, but we can get it from our GitHub site, so github.com/trustedsec. It's literally you just run this command and it gives you a one-liner PowerShell command that you can push on any system that you have remote command execution on, and it just gives you a shell. It's like magic. That's why it's called Magic Unicorn. It has ASCII art that has a red unicorn. It's pretty awesome. But anyways, so with Unicorn, there's also another attack that has Excel injection for macros. And what's great about macros is they're kind of like the thing in the past, because you'd always put like VBS scripts or binaries and things like that in there, and then those would usually get flagged. But in this case, with a lot of the macros, you can just do straight PowerShell injection, never touches disk. And what's great about PowerShell too is that it's usually a whitelisted application, so things like Bit9, things like that aren't going to pick it up. So you have the ability to get remote code execution on a system that has application whitelisting, that has next generation stuff, because it's all in memory, which is fantastic. But in this case, what we found out is that they were using a sandbox technology. So they had some sort of virtualization technology. Does everybody know how virtualization technology works, right? So something comes in via an email, whether it's incoming or a web gateway, and then if it doesn't look right, or it's a certain type of file pattern, it'll actually virtualize it in a sandbox, and then it'll look to see all of the registry calls, if it's doing any type of C2 communications, anything like that. Well, in this case, they had something like that in place, so when I sent the macro, I got the initial stage, but then it just stopped. And it wasn't coming from the initial host that it was coming from, so I'm like, uh-oh, they're using some sort of virtualization technology. I'm not going to say which one it was, but they all pretty much suck. So, but anyways, so we ended up writing some bypass sandbox technology, and it's extremely complex. It took us multiple months of exploit research and development to kind of get around it, but we're going to be releasing it today, which is awesome. Just kidding, it wasn't hard at all. It's like 3 lines of Python code. It took about 14 minutes. Most virtualization technology, the way that it works is that they virtualize in a very predictable sandbox environment. So if you can detect that you're in a sandbox environment, all you need to do is say, if I'm in something that is this pattern, then don't do anything, right? In this case, this specific sandbox technology, which actually works for like 2 of the main 3, I think, if they're using less than 1 CPU or less than 2 CPU cores, so they use 1 CPU core. Does anybody here have a computer that has 1 CPU core? Well, sir, I'd like to talk to you, because you probably couldn't hack you. Man, I'm sorry, I can't see it that far. Ice. Oh, no. Is this ice? No, don't tell me it's ice. Not ice, not ice. Okay, it's not ice, thank God. Just a shadow. Okay, I thought it was ice for a second there. Thanks for... You gotta do it. Okay. Deep Kentucky.
Apparently.
I gotta do it? Oh, I gotta do it, all right. That was easy. I thought it was going to be a warm ice. That would have been terrible. Oh. So in most cases, they're using less than 1 CPU core or less than 2 CPU cores. What you say is, if I'm using in this environment, then don't do anything. So when it comes in and it says, well, am I making any registry changes or anything else? If I'm running in 1 CPU core, then just shut itself down and quit. So then it's like, oh, it's all good. It's cool. And then it passes it off to the end user. So I just built that into PowerShell. And so when it actually executed, it checked to see if it was in a specific CPU core, and then it would shut itself down. And it got past the virtualization technology, which is great. About 14 minutes. So stupid. God. Anyways. So we ended up compromising one of the boxes, one of the people. And I spent like probably a good 20 minutes going through a lot of those boxes. And I ended up compromising this one. And it took some time. But what was great is I already had a established communication path into the environment. So I had a shell, which is great. Now, what was interesting is that the customer did a great job at network segmentation. And so we spent a long time trying to get to the R&D information, which really was difficult to do. And I couldn't find a way to get access to it. But I did find their physical access system that allows you to print badges. So we ended up finding their intranet site. It's like, hey, step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. Step 3, do this. Step 4. Did all of that, created a badge, and walked up to the front desk. This is live footage on the right. So walked into the building, picked up a badge, and walked into the facility. So, I dressed the part, right? You go to this company and it's all like a suit and tie type thing. And so I wore a suit and everything. I walk in and I go to this R&D place, which has like R&D Center of Excellence. It's like this big area with like smoke glass windows and everything. And like they spent a lot of time and money on this, right? And so I badge in and I hit my little pin to walk into the place because I had myself a pin number. And I walk in and it's like one of those moments where like you're like, I walked into the wrong place. Because you have all these people in like jeans and t-shirts and here I am in a suit, right? I walk into this R&D thing, and they're like having this massive meeting of like 50 people, and everybody stops talking and looks at me. At that point, you're like, oh shit. I mean, like, do I walk in and do something, or do I back out and like, pretend like, hey, wrong room, guys, sorry, one of those things. I'm like, ask her, why not? And so I walk in, right? And I walk around the side, and they start talking again or doing whatever. And the worst thing happened, right? I wasn't paying attention. I was trying to I was all nervous because there's people all around me, and they're kind of looking at me like, who's this dude in a suit? Is it, whatever. And so I'm walking, and all of a sudden I see this I fall over a trash can, a metal trash can. There's mustard everywhere all over my suit. People are picking me up off the ground. I honestly sprained my ankle. It was terrible. It's one of those things that you never want to have happen in real life, and it happens in real life, and you're like, that was really me that did that. So they're picking me off the ground, they're cleaning up the mustard, like, are you okay? Are you okay? Everything's great? Well. Anyways, it ended up working out okay. But I was able to plant this device in, and I'm going to be open sourcing this next week. It's called the implant device, a tap device, which I've been working on for about a year. And what it is if you're doing physicals, or you have a place to drop something, if you use an Intel NUC, have you ever heard of the NUCs? They're a small, tiny little thing. You can put an LTE card in it. Usually I put 128 gigs of solid state memory in it, and then I put 8 gigs of RAM. And then what TAP does is it's software that basically uses the LTE network to do a reverse SSH instance out of the network, and it tries to find different ways out. You use the LTE network first, and then it uses the regular network second. And Geoff actually wrote some software that we'll be releasing that actually does a full transparent reverse SSH VPN into the environment. So you can actually create a tap interface off of your device through an SSH tunnel onto the network itself, and then you have a full VPN tunnel into it. Now, if anybody's ever used SSH tunnel, it's kind of like that, but it's more stable. If you've ever tried to do a port scan over SSH tunnel, it doesn't work. This is a full tap interface that you can actually VPN into the environment through an SSH tunnel itself, through an LTE network, and do whatever you want to. And you can also, by the way, deploy this on any Linux machine itself. It doesn't need to be a tap device that you implant. If you compromise a Linux box, you deploy tap, it'll find a port out, it'll establish that reverse SSH connection, and then you SSH VPN into that environment itself. So it works out really well. And what's nice about it is it's self-healing. So if there's an issue with the operating system or an issue with the tunnel, it automatically reconstructs and rebuilds it, and make sure that the health of the operating system there, it keeps all of your tools up to date. So if you want to keep all of your tools local on itself, it'll actually use the reverse SSH tunnel out of the network to update the tools for you. So you don't have to worry about outbound filters on the network itself for tools and updates. So I'll go ahead and release that this coming week here shortly. So that's a new tool that you should see in the GitHub repos on TrustedSec this week. So github.com/TrustedSec. So on that, I could have skipped all of these steps, tripping over the trash can, the mustard, if Geoff had ridden Pivoter earlier. So we can blame Geoff for this one and me having a sprained ankle. And still, I think it's bothered me a little bit. It's flared up yesterday. But anyways, we'll go ahead and introduce Pivoter.
Okay. Well, it all started actually around this time last year when Dave was talking to me about some of these engagements he'd been on and some of the trials he'd had. Specifically, he was, is there anything like SSH for Windows that wouldn't need privileges so we could port forward? And I thought about it a little bit, and I said, yeah, that seems kind of doable. What you're describing is really a SOX proxy, but a reverse proxy, and we could implement that. Of course, I didn't get around to doing it until I started doing more of my own external pen test engagements and needed it myself, and suddenly it was a lot more important to me. Yeah, like Dave said. What had been finding on a lot of pen tests is that mostly bigger companies now, they have a security team, they're doing good things, they've got platform baseline security configurations in place. It's not like 1990 anymore where you installed all of the SQL Server management tools and stuff on every web server and stuff like that, so you could count an enterprise manager being there once you got on a box. What I tend to find is I'll get on a fully patched Server 2008 R2 box with nothing but the minimal support libraries for whatever web application they're running. Typically, though, that web application is still their 5 or 7 year old ASP app that they wrote in-house, and usually I can take advantage of that. Certainly, as I mentioned, there are tools on the Linux Unix side like SSH, dynamic port forwarding, that can kind of do this. And certainly, as Dave mentioned, in Metasploit Pro, you've got that VPN functionality. That's not available to everybody, so I wanted to get something out there that others could use. And also, I find there's a lot of times when I don't necessarily want to use Metasploit for one reason or another. So I kind of came up with some basic objectives. I wanted to have something that would be relatively small payload. As long as I'm dropping on a server that's got the Visual C runtime installed, I can get it down currently to about 13K today. It's a little bigger. It's about 70K if I have to put a statically linked binary out there. I do believe that we can get that a little bit smaller as we work on it some more. I definitely wanted something that didn't need any elevated privileges, because it tended to be the case that I'd end up as IIS user, or maybe I'm a local user on the machine. Usually don't have any good escalation path. I may not even have a good shell. I might be working with some lousy web shell or something like that that's not very interactive. And finally, I wanted to make sure I could support simultaneous connections and stuff, so that I would be able to go ahead and do things like port scans with some efficiency. So got a few slides here that just kind of show how you use the tool. First thing is I went with environment variables to set things up. If you've ever used something like tsocks, you know that it basically acts as a library wrapper around whatever command line tool or whatever application you want to execute. Of course, those tools aren't designed to take some of these inputs. Dave, I don't think we have the picture, but that's all right. Anyway,
I'm going to do interpretive dances here in a second, so we'll be fine.
All right. So anyway, a lot of times those tools don't have any ability to take the input information that I needed, so I thought the easiest way would be to go ahead and communicate with environment variables. I went ahead and also the other piece to this that we'll introduce in a minute, the connection broker, uses those same environment variables just so that setup's a little bit easier. The next step, of course, is actually to start that broker. And what that broker does is it will be listening for the incoming connections from both the service proxy component that you drop and any application that you run when it makes connections outbound. The next step is somehow on our victim, we need to go ahead and start the service proxy. Again, it doesn't need any special permissions. It's not doing anything like trying to bind low ports. It doesn't need to usually have any firewall rules open, because we're going to go out on something that we know is going to be open, like 80, and all the connections are going to be outbound, so we're not listening. And finally, our last step is we go ahead and start our application. Anybody who's used Linux is probably somewhat familiar with using LD preload. What that does is basically it says, hey, load this library first, so when the dynamic linker comes along and gets a call to a function like connect that would normally be in the sockets library, it comes across mine first and runs that, which does a few things, mainly re-steers the traffic over to the broker. And then basically performs the connection and side effects that Connect would normally perform within the program. So if you've ever seen a SOX proxy before, maybe you've used SOXCAP or something like that on Windows, or tsocks on Linux. Usually there's two pieces. There's a SOX proxy out there someplace, and then you have your SOXification wrapper. Basically, I cut a third piece out and move the connection broker away from the proxy server itself, so that it can do all the listening locally on your machine, and we can have a single connection back from the proxy server to that connection broker, which will allow us to basically multiplex all our traffic into that single socket, so we don't see multiple firewall events and stuff that would typically give us away if we were opening a lot of separate connections out. So once we have the proxy connected up, our library wrapper will read the environment and make sure those connect events, get host by name, and a few other things like that actually go over to our broker. Our broker essentially listens to those messages, accepts those proxy connections, and then creates a simple message that it can send down its existing socket over to the proxy. And finally, it uses a fairly simple protocol to do that. It's basically a fixed size protocol, which I'll show you on the next page here. You'll see, actually, I've got, oh boy, we're losing the image again. Okay. Anyway, typically in a SOX proxy, what we had in the past was one connection to the proxy server meant one connection to the remote host. Obviously, that wasn't going to work in this case, so I had to come up with some other method of letting the proxy server keep order as far as where replies needed to go and things like that. So I decided that basically process ID and the file descriptor within that process should be unique enough. And in addition to that, we have a simple command, and it's just an integer type value that's enumerated. And usually those are something like connect, close, get host by name. So as I was implementing it, I did run into a few surprises. Even though we know WinSock basically evolved from BSD sockets, the status codes and return values were different. So I discovered I had to do a little bit of mapping on the Windows side before I fed those values right back to the Linux programs I was running. As I was debugging and trying to figure all this out at first, it led to some interesting chaos that I think exercised some code paths and some things like netcat that never were intended to be hit. Mainly because things would happen like you'd get a valid file descriptor for a connected socket, but yet you'd be getting some return code that meant some sort of failure, and so behavior was rather chaotic. It turned out on the library side, I really didn't actually need to implement too many functions because it was a relatively thin wrapper around the connect call most of the time, or around the get host by name or get adder info type functions, and those actually then just performed the connect to the broker piece otherwise in the usual way. So I didn't have to re-implement the actual socket function or anything like that. I didn't have to necessarily get into all the flow control and pieces that would have been more complicated. Just a few other things before I launch into our demo here. I did look around for some code on the internet before I wrote anything, of course, because you never want to reinvent the wheel, and most people are better programmers than I am, even though I did it for a number of years. What I found typically with most of the open source SOX proxies out there was they were implemented, again, with that idea of one connection in would be one connection out, kind of at their very core, so they didn't have a lot of internal housekeeping that I could leverage when I was going to have to route things back based on file descriptor and PID number and things of that nature, or come up with some other strategy. So I couldn't use a lot of that code, or at least couldn't use it easily, so I decided to go ahead and write my own thing, which is maybe good and bad, I don't know. Of course, I made decisions along the way that every C programmer is familiar with. I decided, of course, to use linked lists so I could keep the traffic flowing in, basically always ready to read on the wire. And also, as far as connected sockets on the outside to remote hosts, sort in a B-tree form. In retrospect, I really wish I would have used like a fixed size array and stepped over it like that. It would have been a much simpler data structure and probably would have led to a simpler implementation. Although ultimately it does seem like the binary tree and stuff performs pretty well. So I decided to continue to live with that for a while. We'll see how things evolve. I did go ahead and decide to video the demo for you guys today, mainly because I'm a terrible typist and you don't really want to sit here while I make a whole bunch of typographical errors and things like that. So we're going to do a little bit of pretending. I've got a vulnerable web application here. You may be familiar with this. It's a software testing tool from a little while ago. It's running on a public 172 IP. There's some other stuff on this DMZ that we're going to get to that's on another 172 space that my attacking PCs can't see directly. First thing I'm doing here is taking advantage of this testing tool a little bit. I'm essentially setting up a test that's going to call PowerShell and rig up a file drop. It'll make the request back to an Apache server I have running. So it's run, or it's continuing to run here. And we're going to see in a second that I actually get an error back from PowerShell. That'll be important later. It tells me that some extra stuff is being tacked on the end of the command line. So you'll see me use PowerShell again just to manage the arguments that need to get passed. Certainly the next thing that happens is I go over and I'm going to look at my Apache log, and I do see that GET request happened, so I know my file drop was at least partially successful. The request happened. Hopefully it got written to the disk. That's the end of this one. So the next thing we need to do is start getting stuff set up on our attacking box. You'll see me actually go ahead twice here and set up the environment in two different tabs. Certainly I could set up the environment once and then background the broker. In this case, I'm choosing not to do that because I want to run the broker with the debug flags enabled and probably run my library without them. Main reason not to run the library with them is it does introduce a lot of extra stuff on standard error that sometimes kind of confuses the output of whatever tool I'm using, makes it difficult to work with. But it's there so you can debug what's going on if something's not working the way you think it should. However, you do get a lot of good debug output from the broker itself that usually lets me know what's going on. So I'll typically run the broker in a separate tab. It is possible to do this tool with some shell injection and via PowerShell, reflective DLL injection, loading and stuff like that. In this case, I went with a simple file drop just for the sake of the demo. It's a lot easier to do that, obviously, and most of the time it works. Typically, in terms of cleanup, that's not all that hard because it's just one file I got to delete later. So not too many issues there. So we're getting ready here with the rest of the environment variables. And I hope that's big enough that people can see it. I don't know.
No. Yeah, we can do full screen. I got it. Don't you worry.
You got it? Yeah? All right. Do you remember?
I may have deleted the videos, though.
I hope you didn't delete the videos.
Nope, right here.
Excellent.
Which one is it, 2?
Oh, I think we were on 2. Guess we'll know in a second.
Is it a little better? All right, I'm going to start interpretive dances here real quick.
All right,
okay?
so Dave's going to do his interpretive dances. Now, you'll notice I don't know if we mentioned this before, but I'm going ahead and stopping Apache. One of the reasons I'm doing that, of course, is I'm going to go instruct my proxy to come back out on port 80. Why? Because I already know it's open, so I don't need to fool with the, anymore guessing whether the firewall is going to let me out. Okay, so at this point we are ready to start the broker. We've got our environment set up. We'll get the separate second tab going. And once I get this environment set up, I'm actually going to pivot to a network that's surprisingly interesting to pivot to that I didn't imagine would be so interesting at first, the 127 network. Turns out a lot of people tend to write firewall rules that trust localhost a lot. Certainly when you open a new socket, usually the source IP address will take the adapter that network is native on. So traffic will look like it's coming from localhost, and it'll end up going to localhost once we do this. So now the next step here, I think, and I guess we got to go to the next video. Dave, can you do that for me? Thank you.
Computers are hard.
Computers are hard. So I'm going to go ahead and use the same injection technique actually to invoke my proxy. Basically, I'm setting up another test here.
By all these commands we have at the end of this, we have a blog post that we did on all of this and all the source and all that good stuff. So, reproducing off of this is a little bit difficult, but we have all of the commands on our website that we put a blog post on. So.
Great. Once again, I just did a really simple PowerShell wrapper there just to swallow the extra stuff that's going to come on the end of it so it doesn't confuse my application. I do have something in the little toolbox that we'll talk about later that can substitute some IP addresses into the binary without having to recompile it, just to simplify things a little bit. I think we're into the next video here, Dave. So now I'm using LD preload. I'm going to go ahead and use our desktop. I'm going to hit the box on localhost. Again, reason for that, essentially now, even though I'm sure the firewall isn't going to let 3389 in, now I'm going through my tunnel, and I'm going to be coming from localhost as far as that box is concerned, and I'm going to localhost. Even if they are running a local software firewall on that box, I'm going to likely be able to do that, and I have PowerShell. The other, not PowerShell, remote desktop. The other reason I wanted to run remote desktop for you guys is just to show you that we can support more than just text mode protocols and actually feed a fair amount of data through this thing at a reasonable rate. So this is just me playing around. I'm guessing that, hey, maybe the application or the password that worked in that web application will also work on the desktop. It doesn't look like I'm being real successful. Just showing you again that I don't need to necessarily get any additional access to that box. We're going to be able to continue this attack on other network hosts behind it. Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to try some other attacks here. I think we're playing the wrong video, but that's fine. Let play, Dave. We'll go with it. This is just an example of scanning with Netcat. I can't scan with Nmap directly. Nmap wants to use raw sockets and things like that, which are a little hard to work with, unfortunately, and we wouldn't be able to implement on the Windows side without some privileges. So you'll see what I did here is I'm just using the V and Z switches on Netcat and scanning for 445. Pretty good way to find Windows hosts. I would like to point out The proxy, of course, can handle multi-threading in terms of making outbound connections on the remote side. So if you want to speed up your scan instead of linearly stepping through every IP address, you could certainly run multiple netcat scans in parallel. Just break up that 24 you want to scan into blocks of 10 or something like that, and run 3 or 4 wide at a time is what I'll usually do. I'm going to continue to let you drive, Dave, rather than try to.
That's scary.
Figure out how to use your trackpad settings. So I did find a box. We're pen testing a web application here, so chances are there's a database somewhere. I'm just going to go ahead and see if MySQL is going to work. So you can see me editing my command there. Again, in an actual attack scenario, without having compromised that box, I'd have to put a lot more footprint on it. I'd have to be dropping down tools to interact with that database, any other tools I wanted to use, any kind of DNS recon I wanted to do, things of that nature, because those utilities probably aren't on that box for me. So what Pivoters were really allowing me to do here for the first time is go ahead and just use tools that I natively have installed on my Kali VM and attack those other VMs behind, or those other machines on that DMZ that are behind that victim box. Turns out, apparently, that this database won't actually talk to me, which is interesting. I guess we'll go to the next video. So there's a little situation with DNS that doesn't always work the way we would have hoped to. To that end, I wrote another tool that just helps me do some additional DNS recon while I'm using Pivoter. And you can see, since we still have that one host that I know about, I'm going to do some things that typically work on a pen test. Typically, a company of any size, there's always an intranet. So I'm going to look for that address, and sure enough, I got back that same address I had before, which probably tells me that maybe that database there is actually to support another web app or something like that. And finally, I went ahead and looked up an outside address. That's another thing I'll always do here to show you that I can get back all the addresses with this tool. But certainly, if we see different DNS resolution inside versus outside, we know some things about how their network is set up as well. Again, just to point out what's going on with the DNS here is I'm actually performing those DNS resolutions via the proxy. So DNS is happening from the perspective of the victim box, not my local Kali box here. So I can see their internal DNS space. The other thing I decided to do with DNS resolution is I went ahead and even if you use the GitHost or getatterinfo family of functions on the Linux side, they map back to the old gethost by name function on the Windows side. The reason for that is that falls back to wins. So I actually end up getting wins information as well, even when there's no DNS response. Anyway, more to come. Certainly, there's a lot more work to do. There are some limitations with the tools. I talked about DNS a little bit. I think we're a few slides back. Yeah, so some workarounds, DNS recon. So this was, and I know you can't read it, so we won't dwell on the slide. It's a really simple DNS resolver. All it does is call getatterinfo and look it up. It's not actually Pivoter aware in any way. When you call it, as you saw in the demo, you actually just wrap it with the library the way you would anything else. We talked quickly about how to speed up some of that scanning with Nmap, or rather with Netcat. And yes, there's definitely more work to do. We certainly want to wrap some more SOX calls. It would be nice to maybe do some interpreter integration just to make things easy. I'd say overall the tool's at that point where we had that lump of enriched uranium on top of the tower in the desert with a bunch of explosives around it. Yeah, we can make it go boom. It's not fully weaponized yet. Typically on a pen test, I'm still altering it and doing a custom compile all the time. But it does work, and it does let us continue on. And I guess I'll hand it back to Dave here.
So I've been working on the SET integration into it. So the new version of SET 5.7 should be out in the next week or so. Should incorporate Pivoter attacks as a default payload as well. So when you're going into Meterpreter and doing your payloads, it'll automatically run an additional Pivoter tool on top of it, so you can still do most of your pen testing work inside of Metasploit, inside of MSF Console, inside of most of your tools that you would typically use on a pen test as part of it. Additionally, I don't know if anybody's had a chance to see the Pen Testers framework, but I'm going to show you a quick demo of it. This is a tool that I released about 2 weeks ago, and the biggest issue that you have with most pen test distributions, like we all love Kali, and Kali is near to dear to our heart, and it's awesome and amazing. It's the best distribution out there. We also roll our own in a lot of cases, right? We roll our own tools and our own pen testing distributions. The biggest thing that I found as being a tester all the time is making sure that I had all the latest and greatest tools out there. So I released the Pen Testers Framework about 2 weeks ago, which is a modular framework around keeping all of your tools up to date. And right now there's over 46 modules that have been written for tools. And what it does is it's literally simple use. I mean, you can just type, you git clone it from GitHub. I like it in my armpit. It's good in my armpit. So if I just git clone it from GitHub, it'll go and grab the latest distribution for it, and then every time you run it from there on out, it'll automatically update itself, so you're running the latest module. So whenever there's a new module added, it'll automatically go into there. Like, for example, just to show you how easy it is, I don't know if you saw the Empire tool from Harmjoy and the other guys out there. Really great talk. Within about an hour, someone had already written a module for that and was already pushed to the PTF framework, and then you could get that tool almost as soon as it was released. Same thing with this. I just pushed, while Geoff was talking, and pushed the GitHub repo for Pivoter. The module has just been added as well. And I'll show you how easy it is. You just run PTF. Oop. So it checks for an internet connection first. It tries to update itself, and if it's running the latest and greatest, it's all set. And then, of course, any tool's got to have ASCII art. But then it's just kind of like Metasploit syntax, right? So I'll go ahead and hit show modules. And you can see here all the different tools that are available, and it's a big screen, so it's kind of broken up. But you can see like Aircrack NG, Comics, SQL Map, Inception, SMB exec. All of those are there, and if you want to install it, you just hit Use Modules. I'll do Exploitation Set. You just go ahead and hit Run, and it automatically goes and installs the tool for you. Now, if you just want to keep it up to date, as soon as you hit Run again, it'll automatically detect that it's been installed and automatically up to date it for you. Now, let's just say you want to do all tools. There's an option here that will hit modules/install_update all. So it'll either install the tools for you or automatically update it for you. So you have a common distribution point for all of your tools. And I missed the /pentest directory. I don't know if anybody used Backtrack or anything below, but I've structured everything around the pentest directory. So when you go to the /pentest directory, it's broken into the penetration testing execution standard methodology. So, exploitation, post-exploitation, reconnaissance, those types of things, intelligence gathering. Those are all structured in that type of framework. And I've also added Pivoter. So you can search for Pivoter, and it's in there as well. So if you just go and use this module, go and run it. Takes a second, the internet's slow, and it's hard. It's done, and you have Pivoter. Easy to go. So a really easy framework. The way that you actually add a module real quick is if you go under modules, I've created a whole framework around building modules that you don't have to require any type of coding whatsoever background. You can literally create a module in about 3 minutes. So let's just go to exploitations, go to set. So the author of the module, the description of the module, right? So the description is going to be, hey, this is the social engineer toolkit. Install type, it supports Git, SVN, and file. So file is if it's like a zip file that you need to go and pull, it'll automatically go and grab it and then unzip it and then extract it for you into that directory. And then the repository location that it needs to go to pull it. And then any Debian dependencies. Right now I have Debian as the main support, but I'm working on Red Hat as well. So you should have RPM support shortly. And then after commands are things that might occur after you've installed something. Like after you've checked it out, you may need to run like install.sh or things like that. After commands will sequence through all the commands. Like, so a complex one, we need Metasploit. Metasploit is an extremely complex one to install. So it does all of the installation procedures for you to install Metasploit for you automatically after it's done getting everything out and installs all the dependencies and all those other things. Additionally, it's pretty efficient. It'll go and install all the modules for you. If you're doing the update all, it'll install the modules real time and then do everything consecutively in a threaded shell. So it'll go through and install everything for you automatically, which is great. So Pivoter is now released. You can go to github.com/trustedsec/Pivoter. It has the latest code base into it. It also links to a blog that walks you through exactly how to set it up, exactly what you need to do to route your traffic through the Pivoter, as well as to do lateral movement post-exploitation. Hopefully it's going to be an evolution, so we're going to continuously make it better as we go along. But one of the things that I know Geoff is doing is continuously updating it as it goes along, and we'll continue to add different changes to it. But if you go to github.com/trustedSec, all the code's there, and I really appreciate everybody coming out to the talk, and hopefully you get some sleep here in the next 3 weeks.
Thanks, everybody.